Hello everybody and welcome to the Common Running Mistakes series. My name is Dr. Cameron Garber with Body Smart, and I'm here with Preston Johnson, a phenomenal runner, and want to thank him for joining us as we discuss some of the common mistakes people make with running. So I want to give a special shout out to a few people that have helped make this series possible. So we've got Utah Running, supports us a ton, supports me a ton. If you need some help, we're always there at the Utah Running Shop every Friday to do free evaluations for runners to check out any injuries or problems you might have. So feel free to come by and check us out, and also Run for Fun, wonderful Facebook group that helps connect runners. And so want to give a shout out to them. Preston has a few shout outs too.
Yeah, thanks for letting me be here. I'm really excited to be a part of this series and be able to share some of my knowledge with your followers as well as with my followers. I wanted to thank Solomon Running and Gnarly Nutrition. They're my personal sponsors and have always been there for me and helped me out. And then the Wasatch Run Club, a new group that I've just started that I hope that will enjoy these videos and be able to learn from them and be able to use them in their training.
So excited about the Wasatch Run Club coming up. That'll be really cool. And it started already, some challenges and miles being recorded on Strava and everything. So pretty cool, pretty fun stuff. So we want to thank you again for joining us. Today we want to talk about overloading. So one of the most common problems that I see as a physical therapist for runners is people overloading their tissues too much, which is a little bit different than overtraining. Overloading is a slight nuance. They're very interrelated. But essentially, all running problems, all running injuries are essentially an overloading problem where we've loaded a tissue too much. And so there are three main ways that we're going to cover today on how you overload the tissues. One is time, the other is intensity, and then the third is just putting too much load volume, so too much weight essentially onto your tissues. And that's what causes our injuries and what causes that overloading. And so let's kind of dive into what that means, all of those things, and how do we prevent that.
Yeah, the first thing I want to talk about is really the differentiation between overloading and overtraining, because there, like Cameron said, there is a very small difference there, but it's important to know the difference between the two. Overloading, a great example of that is going to be, you're fit, you're trained, you're ready to be training, but you may have a day where you go and on your run you have a bunch of climbing. Maybe you climb a couple thousand feet, and most of your runs prior to that have been flat runs. Your body's not going to be used to that climbing. That's going to cause that overloading issue that we're talking about on your muscles because it's not used to that type of training.
Right. Yeah, well, and that's a great example that we talked about the other day was when somebody's coming back from an injury. We see this all the time where they do other things to keep their fitness up, so their heart and lungs feel great. And so they'll sprain an ankle on the trail and they'll do a lot of like elliptical and bike and other things like that so that they keep their training volume up so that their heart and lungs do great. But then they quickly transition back to running. And you have to understand that your load that you've been placing on those tissues is not the same type of load. And so that tends to, even though you're not necessarily overtraining, your volume of training was maintained, but your volume of load on those specific tissues all of a sudden really increased. And so that's one of the areas. So time, intensity, and then amount of load are some of those three. So let's define those really quickly. Time is basically time spent doing a specific type of training. So like you said, hill training, if I do too much hill training too quickly, and the muscles that are responsible for getting me up the hill then become at greater risk for a problem. So Achilles, quadriceps tendon are common things that we see with a lot of climbing. Even though you may be running a lot, if you spent an inordinate amount of time climbing, you're going to find that puts increased stress on some of your, especially tendons and ligaments, or tendons, I mean, more. Whereas uphill training, if you're dealing with like a bone stress fracture, may actually be a really good way to cross train or a bone stress injury, maybe not a fracture, you want to back off for a little bit there. But if you're having a bone stress injury, you may want to do more uphill training because it's kinder on the bones because there's less impact, but it's harder on the tendons and things. So you have to really watch what you're putting stress on. So the amount of time that you spend doing an activity, that kind of makes sense, right? The intensity then is how hard you go.
Yeah, so one of the things that jumps to my mind with that is, first off, when you're running, a good training plan will have variation between intensities. You want your easy days and you want your hard days. And they should be very exclusive. Your hard days should be hard and your easy days should be kept very easy. But when you first introduce those hard days, after maybe a big base building phase where you're adding in lots of mileage, maybe you'll start getting to more race specific stuff. You start doing stuff at threshold pace for your marathon or some intervals for a 5K. And that stuff is a shock to your body. It's not used to running that fast.
Right.
And so generally when we get to that kind of stuff, easing into those training plans by either shortening the volume of the load that we're doing or maybe making those intervals a little bit slower before we start and kind of working into that intense stuff is very beneficial as opposed to jumping straight into it.
Right. I see this all the time in the clinic, right, where people have been training for a while and then they get serious about a specific race, and so they start adding the speed work back in, and inevitably that's where that hamstring strain, the pesky hamstring strain, right, that's where that tends to come in. And it's always on a speed work day. It's usually their first speed work day of the season when they haven't done it for a while and they go back at it, and like you said, they're going all out usually instead of kind of building up that speed work and building up your tolerance of the intensity. They kind of go too hard, maybe do too many repetitions of kind of their intervals. It's good to do, and it's a fine line, right? We talk about that all the time with Preston, where he's training at kind of an elite level. That zone between injury and pushing yourself to improve can sometimes be a really fine line. But so that's something you really have to watch, that you're not doing too much. When you feel that fatigue set in, it may be a good time with your speed work to kind of to let it go and build up and for another day.
Yeah. And for me, that comes down to a motivation factor and being disciplined about your motivation.
Right.
When I get into a big training block, I usually am really excited when I first start. The idea of what I can accomplish after that training. And so those first few workouts, you're always amped up, you're ready to go, you want to run fast, you remember times you ran in a previous training block, and you always want to beat those previous times. But being disciplined to really bring that back a little bit is really important.
Right. And
the key there.
Yeah, I agree. And letting time kind of work in your favor, knowing that if I just put in the time and consistent with it, I'll build up eventually and be okay. And I'll beat those times, but I may not be able to do it quite today. So pushing for it today may set you back in the long run. So just be careful with that. Really listen to your body and be careful there with increasing your intensity too quickly. We see that as a problem quite a bit. And then the volume of load is another problem. And so by volume of load, I mean more essentially body weight. So it's a kind way of saying if we're overloading that tissue, sometimes we're doing too much in body weight, or if we're wearing a pack or things like that. And that's often where we see a problem. I see that a lot in the clinic, where people come in and they're asking about plantar fasciitis or Achilles tendonitis or other things like that. And sometimes it's just a load adaptation thing where it's so much load if they've got a higher body mass. It's so much load to have to adapt to that may be difficult for your body to make that transition. And so it will take you going slower for a lot longer to allow your body to adapt. And hopefully in that going slower process, you also wind up losing some weight and getting in better shape and allowing your body to adapt. But know that if you've got increased body weight, you're going to have to take a little bit longer period of time to really adapt and overcome and be resilient enough that you're not overloading that tissue.
Yeah, some of the best advice I'd ever gotten from some of my coaches is that with your training, you should be living in months and years from now as opposed to this weekend.
Yeah.
So when you go out for a run, you go out for a workout, you shouldn't be thinking about how this workout's going to impact 4 days from now. You should be thinking, okay, long-term plan, running is about patience. It's
Right.
about being consistent. It's about being dedicated. How is this going to affect me in 4 years from now? Is this workout going to push me over the top? Is it going to get me injured? Is it going to set me back that way?
Yeah.
And if we control that, that comes down to that load volume, in that when it comes to losing that weight and getting back down to race weight, that's not something that's going to happen overnight.
Right.
There's lots of fad diets and things out there like that, but it comes down to just doing the right things
Right.
day in, day out over a consistent period of time.
Amen. I agree with that. It's really about consistency more than intensity of effort.
Mm-hmm.
The consistency of effort is where we wind up winning in the long run. And what keeps us safe and injury-free, actually increasing how often you're training, but decreasing the load of each training session, can actually be a really good thing that helps us to adapt more quickly and really helps us in the long run. It's the consistency of training where we're really going to be successful. It doesn't help us very much to go out, push really hard, and then get injured. Now I have to take 6-8 weeks off, and I'm starting over at square one again. In fact, there's evidence that when we push too hard, get injured, and come back, that our risk of injury in coming back is even higher than it was before, because we've taken time off. The adaptations that we've made, we've lost, and yet our motivation to come back is strong. And so we wind up overloading that tissue even more quickly. And so that's something I talk about a lot, is that tissue overload, because that's the way my brain thinks as a physical therapist, right? We tend to, like, if this line is injury and my run brings me close to that injury and then backs off, right, depending on what I'm doing every day. And so we want to kind of skirt that line to some degree so that we push ourselves to get better and force our body to become more resilient. We have to overload the tissue to some capacity. It's just how we're doing that. And so the closer I come to that line, the more I'm going to force my body to make a change. The problem is when I cross that line, then my next workout keeps it across that line, and that injury risk becomes higher and higher. And so that's kind of what we're talking about, is making sure that we're doing things that push us close to that line of fatigue and injury and things, but that we never cross it, that we always do enough to maintain our body and keep healthy. And so as far as avoiding it, I definitely think that taking enough time to recover is important, whether that's time or effort in recovery. I think that's a common place where a lot of runners don't spend enough time, is in recovery. I know you it's part of your full-time gig is recovering.
Yeah, it's huge.
Right.
And I think the biggest thing that I've seen comes back to really knowing your body and the tendencies that you have.
Yeah.
So for me in particular, I tend to get a lot of posterior tibialis stress.
Yeah.
And so whenever I start to feel something like that come on, it's generally a good sign that, okay, like this is something that's been a problem for me in the past.
Yeah.
I'm getting that tissue overload there. I need to back off. I need to do something to change that, whether it be heading into the clinic and running on the light speed lift, or it's cross training, jumping in the pool, or maybe it's just a matter of shortening that run that day, just cutting back on the volume a little bit.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think that's great. It's important to listen to your body and really manage those loads so that you can stay injury free. And that's something I have Preston and several other runners that come in fairly regularly, basically almost every week, to get something worked on to help, manage that load, manage that so that he doesn't get injured. And I'm a big believer too that if you're training today, kind of like what you were saying before, with that long-term outlook, if your training today ruins your training tomorrow, then it was kind of pointless. And so be careful, listen to your body, don't do something that you're going to regret tomorrow, and be consistent, I think, are kind of the take-home messages. I love it. Any other final words of advice?
No, I think we just about covered it. Just want to thank all you guys for tuning in and checking out our new series. We look forward to having you at our next one.
Yeah, definitely. So if you've got any questions for myself or Preston, feel free to drop those in the comments down below. We would love to respond and answer to that. Feel free to call us at the clinic at Body Smart. as well, and we can answer any questions you might have about running and common running mistakes. Again, thanks so much for joining us on the Common Running Mistakes series of videos that we're going to make, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks.
Thank you.